So yesterday I covered some information concerning the application Parler, the social media website, and it wasn't correct and accurate information. So I pulled that video down because I wanted to make a correction. And it's funny because I actually knew this story. I remembered it, just I couldn't remember all the details. So I want to read this article covering what actually happened to Parler, how it was pulled off Android and iOS stores and pretty much shut off by Amazon's web hosting services. So I'm going to get to this article. This article is from a website called The Conversation. I don't know how reliable the website is itself, but some of the stuff that it covered as far as this Parler story is concerned is actually accurate. So I wanted to read this so I can make a correction. This is why I pulled the video down. And I thought to myself, man, when I went over this information, I should have actually pulled up an article instead of just, saying whatever. Anyway, big tech's rejection of Parler shuts down a site favored by Trump supporters and used by participants in the U.S. Capitol insurrection. Okay, so I am going to say this, even though I will fully admit this is my personal opinion. I think calling this an insurrection is also a personal opinion. This was not an insurrection. By no means. Some people went to the Capitol, rioted, damaged some things. That's the extent of it. It wasn't the attack on democracy that they hyperbolically claim it to be. And I think that's the way this article frames it. Obviously, they have a certain bent. But anyway, early in the morning on January. Oh, yeah. Let me also add this caveat. This is part of really the big reason that Parler was pulled off Android and iOS stores and why Amazon's web hosting services cut them off. Coincidentally, Facebook was used by many of the Capitol rioters of that day to organize. And it was actually used more in those circumstances than Parler, which is what made this an obvious hit job. Parler was gaining a lot of traction. As I said before, that is true. And Parler is not part of the club. So they definitely didn't want that anyway. Early in the morning on January 11th, the social media platform Parler went offline after Amazon withdrew the platform's web hosting services. Parler sued Amazon in response. Amazon's move followed Google and Apple banning the Parler app from the app stores. And if you remember, during this time, Parler was gaining so much traction that it was fully expected to unseat Twitter from its position. The tech companies cited the platform's inability or unwillingness to block calls for the threats of violence. Amazon's move shut the platform down, at least until the company can find an alternative web hosting service. And this really did Parler in. It did Parler in really bad. Like I said, at the time, Parler was at the top of the charts as far as the Android and iOS app stores go. It was the application, the social media site that was being most talked about. Definitely gaining traction that the establishment social media players absolutely did not want Parler to have. And you can see, even though this article definitely has a bent, they believe they were right in their actions, but you can see how they shut out someone that was outside of their orthodox viewpoint. Parler had a surge in new users following Twitter's ban of President Donald Trump on January 8th since the November election. When it saw a spike in usage, Parler has contributed to the widening gap between the different perceptions of reality held by the polarized public. And I will say this, I don't think it was necessarily any social media app. Now, don't get me wrong, these social media apps definitely had their play in fostering the dissent and fostering the the problems between people and dissenting views. But Parler especially and social media didn't necessarily cause this. I think it is more indicative of a problem we see in the mainstream media, because for the longest time people still consume mainstream media. Now social media has taken over. But I would say that this time during this election, maybe a little bit before, this is that transition period. Social media is taking over as far as how people get new information. But I think the mainstream media, news organizations, and their coverage or lack thereof of certain things is what caused the schism between peoples, because the different perceptions in reality came from this. Now, I don't have an issue watching mainstream news, but I'm kind of a I wouldn't I want to say research junkie, not really a research junkie, but when something interests me or there's a big enough story like this, right? I covered this yesterday, and I knew when I said it, I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. I vaguely remember what happened to Parler, and I'm pretty sure it had something to do with the other social media apps. And so I went back and looked it up again to verify. Anyway, I digress. When I hear things from the mainstream media and I say, that's interesting, this sounds kind of crazy, I go back and I research what these, whatever news organization said, and I look deeply into it, and then I figure out, what they said is actually not true. The way they frame this story would have you believe one thing when in all actuality, there is a completely separate thing that's actually true. And I think that is really what has caused the different perceptions of reality. Because if I just take the news on its face, I have a certain view of what's going on. But if I look into this thing myself, I come away thinking, wait a minute, what the news told me and how they sold this story is actually not true at all. And so I will have a perception of what is, and somebody that just accepted that news report on face value will have a completely different view. And thus we have two completely different views of what actually happened. There's what actually happened, and there's what the news told you happened. Those don't always match. And I think that's what has really caused the biggest problem. Competitor Gab was similarly forced offline after the 2018 mass shooting, and that's the app I was thinking about that got caught up in a mass shooting. Competitor Gab was similarly forced offline after the 2018 mass shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, but it was only temporary. Shooter Robert, I'm not even going to mention his name. Anyway, shooter blank blank had been posting anti-Semitic and violent content on the platform, and the revelation resulted in PayPal, GoDaddy, and Medium's banning of Gab from their services. Gab has since come back online and has reportedly gained hundreds of thousands of new users since Parler shut down. And Gab actually does have a lot of users, and they've really, what has happened, and I said this yesterday, what has happened is many of these new social media companies, after seeing what happened to Parler built up and built out an entirely independent infrastructure so they wouldn't have to depend on stuff like this and they wouldn't be shut down. So I just wanted to cover that, go over some things that I had mistaken. I was mistaking Gab and Parler when I was going over that episode, so that's why I pulled it down. I'm going to put that episode back up when I post this video right here.